Since becoming the second state to adopt Christianity as the state religion, the splintered kingdoms of Georgia became the battleground between the Romans and Sassanids, but thanks to their formidable defences and warrior culture, they were able to maintain a degree of autonomy, even if it meant that they had to pay tribute or be raided by enemy forces, including nomads from the north like the Khazars and Alans. But while most of Georgia survived, the key city of Tbilisi fell to the Rashidans. By the early 11th century, the state was powerful enough to contest with the Eastern Roman Empire, especially after the death of Basil II. It was during this time that the Seljuk riders entered the scene and crushed both, forcing Georgia to pay an annual tribute. In 1072, only a year after the Battle of Manzikert, George II, who was a member of the powerful ruling Bagrationi dynasty, took the throne. Almost instantly, his nobles started a rebellion that he had to quell with gifts, right before Alparslan devastated the capital of Kartli. In 1076, Malik Shah reduced several towns to ruins. Arguably the only good thing that the king would do was abdicate the throne to his son David IV, who was just 16 years old in 1089. Powerful nobles, Seljuk invasions, and disastrous earthquakes significantly reduced the already depleted and depopulated Georgian state. David was starting from scratch and had to rebuild and reform his domain in order to stand a chance against the nomads who broke the Eastern Roman Empire itself. Luckily, he was well educated by his tutor and future chancellor George of Chondidi. Georgia had great ties with the Byzantines, which gave David access to their literature, treatises, and military manuals. Initially, his reign was uneventful, as he sought to repopulate some abandoned areas and drilled small contingents of his army into a capable fighting force, while strengthening his rule. To get a sense of how weak Georgia was at the time, we only need to look at 1092, the year Malik Shah died, leading to the Seljuk Civil War. Despite the fact that his enemies were distracted, David didn't risk an expansionist policy. Instead, he took his time to confront the Laparidids, which ruled the Duchy of Kildikari with full autonomy and were the biggest internal rivals of his Bagrationi dynasty. David arrested the head of the rebellious dynasty and consolidated their domain by 1103. While this limited act during such an opportune moment could be seen as weakness, it also shows the calculating nature of the Georgian king and the state of affairs in the region. Many Muslim-dominated cities in the area were mostly autonomous and posed a threat on their own, even when the empire was in turmoil. But by the time the Crusaders arrived in the Levant, the king was ready to face his challenges head-on, with a firmly centralized rule and a capable army. In 1099, shortly after the capture of Jerusalem, Georgia announced that it would no longer pay tribute to the Seljuk Empire, and David rejected the Byzantine court title of Panhypasibastos. The first step towards independence was taken, but this was only the start. Luckily for the Georgians, the Seljuk Empire was yet again in the midst of a brutal succession crisis. Muhammad Tepar started his rebellion against the Seljuk Sultan, Bokyuruk, from his base in Ganja and fought a long war for the throne, which took 5 years, until the treasury was exhausted and the rebel took the throne for himself. This time around, David got busy and captured the strategic fortress of Zedazeni in 1103. This ambitious move worried many of the nobility of the Kingdom of Kakheti, another Georgian state, which was a tributary of the Seljuk Empire, so they asked the unnamed Atabeg of Ganja for aid. Atabegs were governors of the Seljuk regions, who at the time of turmoil would often become independent or autonomous. In 1104, this governor arrived with his army, only to be defeated near Etsuchi. In 1105, two powerful Kakhetian nobles captured their king, Agsatan, and delivered him to David's hands. The first battle was won, and the kingdom of Kakheti was annexed. In order to avoid overexpansion, David stopped to consolidate his new lands and assembled the Council of Ruri-Surbenisi in 1105, where he met with the majority of the powerful Georgian clergy. There he reformed the old system, where positions and lands were inherited, and replaced it with a centralized system, which reduced corruption, but more importantly strengthened the state's power by restricting the powerful feudal families. By this point, the Seljuk succession crisis was over, and Georgia once again entered a phase of stabilization and reform. Despite being seen as a threat, no Seljuk retaliation arrived, as the new sultan was busy dealing with separatist movements in Jabal, Iraq, and in particular the Ismailis, Assassins. This included a massive attack by Kilij Arslan, who invaded and captured Mosul before being vanquished. In 1110, the military campaigns resumed, coinciding with another period of distraction, during which the Atabeg of Mosul failed to take Edessa, while the Crusaders conquered Beirut, Sidon, and cracked a Chevalier. David sent out his mentor and chancellor, George of Chondidi, who captured the important fortress of Samshrilda, an action that prompted the retreat and evacuation of many other Muslim outposts in the area. Sources mention an army sent in retaliation that was defeated near Trialeti without any further details. These victories encouraged the Georgian king, who launched a campaign in Aran, focusing on the city of Ganja. Once again, we lack definitive details, but from what we can tell, David failed to take the city, so instead he raided the countryside. In response, Sultan Muhammad I sent an army that pushed the Georgians back and raided some of their lands before withdrawing. In 1114, a major earthquake struck Antioch, damaging its walls. In that moment of weakness, the Seljuk Empire assembled an 8,000-strong army under the emir of Hamadan, Bursuk ibn Bursuk. Unfortunately for the Seljuks, they didn't have the support of every Muslim state. Damascus, Aleppo, and most importantly the Archakids allied with the Crusaders, led by Roger of Salerno and Baldwin II. Ilghazi was the son of Artuk Bey, a general of Malik Shah, and member of another Oghuz tribe, and founder of the Archakid dynasty, centered around Diyarbakir and Mardin. The allied army launched a devastating ambush and defeated Bursuk at the Battle of Samin in 1115. David was quick to act this time and launched a new campaign, capturing Rushdevi in 1115. In 1117 he took Gishi, while his son plundered the Seljuk vassal Shirvan, and in 1118 the provincial capital of Lori fell to Georgian hands. By this point, without any major defeat or significant casualties, David was able to significantly expand his state and isolate the Emirate of Tbilisi from the rest of the Islamic world. However, the king still knew the limitations of his state, prompted by years of Seljuk raiding that depopulated the countryside. With every captured settlement, his military capabilities decreased, as he needed men to garrison the new fortresses and patrol the borders. And so, between 1118 and 1119, David focused on military reform. The traditional Georgian heavy cavalry, wearing lamella armor, chainmail, and armed with spears, swords, battle axes, and maces, was raised. An elite royal guard called the Monaspa was created, consisting of foreign warriors, similar to the Varangians. Mercenaries were hired from tribes living north of the Caucasus, but one nomadic group in particular was given special attention. Back in 1109, the Kievan Rus inflicted a crushing defeat on the Kipchak nomads, led by Chief Otrok, who led his people, including women and children, to the lands of Georgia. In 1118, David married Otrok's daughter and had them baptized and settled in crucial areas. Additionally, each Kipchak family was to provide one horseman who would serve under the king. Indeed, a large portion of the royal guard was made up of Kipchak warriors. Finally, in order to ensure the fast movement of his troops around the country, the maintenance of roads and bridges was made a top priority. As we previously mentioned, 1118 was the year the Crusader king, Byzantine emperor, and Seljuk sultan all died, which set the stage for the rise of a man who up until this point was stumbling from one failure to the next. Ilghazi spent the last 2 decades shifting allegiances and captors, but by 1118 he had full control of Aleppo. In 1119 he attacked his old ally, Roger of Salerno, at what would be known as the Battle of the Field of Blood. Crucial intelligence allowed him to maneuver his 20,000-strong army through lesser-known paths and surround the Crusader camp. Roger quickly formed up his 700 knights, 500 Armenian cavalry, and 3,000 infantry into 5 divisions, lined up in a V-shaped formation, pointing away from the Muslim army, and left the 6th division to defend the rear. While the two sides formed up, a Muslim cleric charged in, which inspired the rest to join him. The Crusader right and centre held firmly, as archers from both sides exchanged fire, but the battle was decided on the left, where the mercenary Turcopoles were driven into the centre, breaking the formation. The confusion only intensified as a north wind blew dust in the faces of the knights, obscuring their vision, and before long they were encircled by the larger host. The majority of the army was killed or captured, including Roger himself, who was struck by a sword. The Antiochian army was decimated, and many cities fell to the Artukids. A few months later, King Baldwin II confronted Ilghazi at the Battle of Hub, where 700 knights and a few thousand infantry won a narrow tactical victory, with both sides taking significant losses. Antioch was saved, but the losses ensured that it would quickly fall under the influence of the new Byzantine Emperor John II Komnenos. Ilghazi managed to spin the second battle into another victory, painting himself as the Islamic champion who managed to defeat the Crusaders, comparing himself with Seljuk Sultan Mahmud II, who was little more than a puppet. Meanwhile, to the north, by 1120, the Emirate of Tbilisi was run by a rich merchant oligarchy, cut off from the rest of the Muslim world and facing an expansionist Christian state. Suddenly, David was the one demanding tribute from the Muslims, and even subjugated Shirvan that same year. In response, the traders of Tbilisi Ganja and Dmanisi called for Ilghazi to aid them against this growing threat. While some Seljuks joined this coalition, it is important to note that the Sultan himself had limited power and gave little more than his blessings for the campaign. This was an opportunity for Ilghazi to capitalize on his fame and significantly expand his state against the Georgian aggressors, so he signed a one-year truce with the Crusaders and rallied his forces, which were joined by the Atabeg of Ganja and minor emirs from Armenia. At this point, we should address the controversial points, which have caused the imminent Battle of Didgori to be considered more a legend than actual fact. At its very core, history is the study of sources, and each source has some level of bias or agenda. Over time, certain chroniclers, scholars, or states can warp the perceptions about a certain topic, and the Battle of Didgori is one of the most egregious examples. Some Islamic contemporaries ignored or omitted the events, while Christian scholars exaggerated the number of the Islamic coalition to 800,000. In this and many other cases, nationalism only made things worse, as at various points, nations looked towards glorious moments of their past in an attempt to solidify their identity, a process only made more complicated with 2 centuries of Russian and Soviet rule, which at times attempted to suppress the national identities, while at other times used them for propaganda means. Many generations saw this battle as a heroic Christian last stand against an impending Muslim power, while in reality both sides had soldiers from both faiths and purely political interests. Luckily, newly translated works provided to us thanks to the great work of people like PhD Nika Hoparia allow us to present a more accurate version of these important events. First, let's look at the army compositions of the two sides. The fact that Ilghazi led an army of 20,000 in 1119 gives us a good range of how large his army was in 1121. His own force was joined by many smaller factions who wanted to retaliate against the Georgian incursions, making the 30,000 figure, cited by Arab historian Ibn al-Athir, who wrote in the 13th century, highly plausible. The numbers of the Georgian army were also exaggerated, especially if we consider the population of the region and how many fortresses needed to be garrisoned. Georgian military historian Soso Margashvili thinks that David had 15 to 18,000 soldiers in his army. This number included several thousand highly trained Kipchaks, the heavy cavalry Royal Guard or Manaspa, 500 Alan mercenaries, and 200 Franks. The inclusion of the Franks is unlikely, but not impossible. Small and well-drilled detachments of 20 to 100 added to the flexibility of this force, allowing it to perform difficult military maneuvers. At the start of June 1121, the Islamic coalition left Mardin and moved through Erzurum, Kars until they arrived at Trialeti, growing stronger as coalition members poured in. The goal was to reach Mitkvari and establish a base of operation, making the capture of Tbilisi impossible. However, these movements were anticipated and tracked by David IV, who confronted the coalition half a day away from Tbilisi. The conventional idea is that the battle was fought at the mountain of Didgori, but in reality, based on the sources and terrain, that was neither the location of the confrontation, nor was there a single battle. This was less of a single battle between two forces, and more of a campaign with numerous military actions and skirmishes. In mid-August, a trap was set for Ilgazi. 200 Kipchak horse archers left the main army and fled to the camp of Ilgazi, who welcomed the deserters to his host. Soon after, the nomads attacked the camp, shooting every commander in sight before fleeing. The chase went on for several hours until the coalition entered a valley. Hidden from view in the west, David lay in waiting, while his son, Prince Demetere, was on the right. As the enemy approached, the king gave a speech to boost the morale of his soldiers, cited by the Crusader chronicler Walter the Chancellor. "Soldiers of Christ, if we fight with abandon, defending the faith of our Lord, we shall not only overcome the countless servants of Satan, but the devil himself. I will only advise you one thing that will add to our honor and our profit. Raising our hands to heaven, we will all swear to our Lord that in the name of love to him, we will rather die on the battlefield than run." For those who were untouched by the royal words, fallen trees were piled behind them, ensuring there could only be one way to go. As the enraged Ilgazi pushed his force inside a valley, a heavy cavalry contingent smashed into his vanguard and halted his momentum. At that moment, the Georgian forces poured in from both sides and clashed with the larger but confused enemy. Couched lances smashed against the artichokes, while arrows were shot from the Kipchak archers. Before long, Ilgazi was seriously wounded and fled with the remnants of his army, leaving a considerable amount of captives and plunder for David. This carefully planned maneuver utilized the strengths of the Kipchaks, royal guard, well-trained infantry detachments, and intelligence network on an ideal terrain. By denying access to the economic center of Tbilisi, David ensured that the war would be fought on his terms. This point becomes even more apparent if we include the suggestion by Georgian military historian Soso Margishvili that David attacked and defeated the army of Ganja before the coalition even assembled. The following year, Georgia took control over the city and made it the new capital of the kingdom. In 1124, Dmanisi, Shirvan and Ani also fell. When David took the throne in 1089 at the age of 16, he inherited a fractured, plundered and weak state, fighting for its survival. Now at the age of 51, he laid on his deathbed, leaving behind a united and consolidated regional power. It is difficult to ascertain how much this battle changed the geopolitical situation, but it is undeniable that David IV Bagrationi made Georgia a regional power, setting the stage for the future Georgian Golden Age that will come with the female king Tamar the Great. We'll talk about her reign and more events that happened in the Caucasus in our future videos, so make sure to subscribe and press the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps us immensely.